Seats up front if there are none left in the back. Those in the front pews are the purists, so move up. To welcome you to the 28th Paul Arrington Memorial Lecture. My name is Jim Pease. I am a faculty member in the Department of Animal Ecology who annually sponsors this lecture. It's one of the sponsors of this lecture. Paul Arrington was born in 1902 and in South Dakota. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in 1932 and joined this department, the Department of Animal Ecology here at Iowa State, where he remained for the remainder of his distinguished career. Paul married Carolyn Storm in 1934, and distinguished his life with a number of excellent works in population biology, particularly in muskrats and mink, and was well known for his strengths in the field. This lecture series is to honor Dr. Arrington as a naturalist in the best sense of the term. In 1961, Life magazine featured Paul Arrington as one of the 10 outstanding naturalists of North America, and he was not only an expert in the field, but also an expert at evaluating the various forces that nature brings to bear upon populations of animals. Paul, he passed along a very much a priceless heritage of conservation wisdom and insight, and set a standard, I think, for this department for many decades to come. We have with us tonight, once again, his wife, Carolyn. Carolyn, would you stand and be recognized, please? Thank you. Carolyn has seen to it that not only is the Paul Arrington Memorial Lecture Fund continued every year, but she also sees fit to entertain our speaker each year. And we had a delightful luncheon today with Dr. Jackson. This particular lecture, as I say, is the 28th. It began in 1964, and we have brought to this campus a wide variety of people that are very distinguished in the field of conservation and ecology. We're pleased this year to have Dr. Wes Jackson with us. Bringing people to the campus requires a number of different participants. We want to acknowledge tonight people who have helped make this possible. Certainly the Department of Animal Ecology is grateful to the Committee on Lectures who helped co-sponsor Dr. Jackson's trip. The Paul Arrington Memorial Lecture Fund, the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture, the Departments of Agronomy and Philosophy and the Environmental Studies Program, the Fisheries and Wildlife Biology Club, and also the Center for Ag and Rural Development here on campus. All of those departments provided financial support to bring Dr. Jackson here to campus. Wes Jackson was born in 1936 on a farm near Topeka, Kansas, and he has formal degrees in bachelor's in botany from Kansas Wesleyan in 1958, a master's in botany from the University of Kansas in 1960, and a PhD in genetics from North Carolina State University in 1967. Before he founded the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas in 1976, he served as a high school biology teacher on the front lines, as it were. He was a professor at Kansas Wesleyan, and in 1973 became the first director of the Center for Environmental Studies at California State University in Sacramento. At the founding of the Land Institute in 1976, he began not only a change in direction in his personal life, but most certainly in his professional life, giving up the relative security, if you would call it that, these days, of a university environment to strike out on his own to solve some problems in ecology and agriculture that in some rather novel ways. He has received a number of awards and honors for his work, and you can see some of those listed in your program. We're very pleased to have with us tonight Dr. Wes Jackson.
Thank you very much. Well, it's indeed a pleasure to be back to Iowa State. I was mentioning this afternoon in the seminar that, in a way, Iowa State is an alma mater of mine. I spent a summer here working with Dr. Dwayne Isley in botany, where I did the work for the revision of the Phleoides section of Petalostemon. And that brought me national recognition right away. I never had any trouble since. But it was a wonderful time that I was here. And it was wonderful to have such a mentor as Dr. Isley. I'm also greatly honored that to be a part of this Arrington lecture and to know Mrs. Arrington and to think what it means to live in a culture that has such richness due to individuals who have allowed maybe not 1,000 lights to shine, but one or two important lights to shine here and there. So I'm glad to be back again as an alma mater, to my alma mater of sorts. I have chosen as a topic something I'm thinking about these days, and usually that which I'm thinking about in these days has a fair amount of half-baked thinking. And so I make myself vulnerable to you, the audience. And I do because I think the university tradition is one in which, in the past, we were willing to make ourselves vulnerable to one another. It's become so it's not so much that way anymore, but it seems to me that the risk, that informed risk, is what we need to be doing these days in thinking through this experiment on this continent. There was a time in which things were pretty well settled at the time that the Ptolemy system of the universe was well understood. There were anomalies that kept piling up, but from the point of view of those living at the time of the Ptolemy system, when the Earth was at the center of everything, those anomalies could be taken care of with some calculations, some fudge factors that would make the whole system seem coherent. But the anomalies kept piling up, and the mathematicians had to keep working away to patch the thing up. And finally comes along a Copernicus who says, it is a matter of a perception that the Earth is at the center of things and everything else is going around the Earth. In fact, the reality is that the sun is at the middle and the planets are going around it, and it's because of our position on the Earth that it appears otherwise. Now, that did more than simply take the human or the Earth out of the center of the universe. It taught us a very important thing that has become one of the foundations of science, and that is the difference between appearance and reality. And Galileo, nearly 100 years later, further substantiating Copernicus' notion, tried to get the churchmen to look through the telescope and confirm what had been postulated, and the churchmen refused to look through the telescope. And we look back on that era as a time in which those narrow-minded ancestors of ours refused to look through the telescope of Galileo, and in which the church for 200 years refused to allow the people to read what Galileo had to say. It was 200 years before there was a taking it all back. And we think how narrow those folks were. And there were those at a time, just as a little digression here, I feel these coming on now and then, in which there were people who debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin. And we thought how quaint those folk were. And now we have those folks that are wanting to create the ultimate wreck, where they're going to have the super collider, that is going to send these atoms in opposite directions and slam into one another at twice the speed of light, in order to get some idea of how small things can get. Angels dancing on the head of a pin. So in a certain sense, we're hardwired for certain ways of thinking, and we seem not to let go of some of those ways of thinking. Well, Galileo finally had his way, and Newton followed, and we have, of course, in there about 1600, Francis Bacon and René Descartes, and we have eventually coming out all of it, a scientific revolution, and we still have with us the legacy of the importance of making a distinction between the apparent and the real, and we still don't seem to be very good at acting on reality. So with that in mind, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the modern problems that are apparent. We think we have some problems that are apparent, and we think that there are some apparent causes, but I'm going to submit that there are some real causes that have to do with our thinking that stand behind a good many of these apparent problems. Well, one of the perhaps the most apparent problem that we of the developed world like to talk about is the problem of overpopulation, because that's off somewhere else. That's in Mexico, it's in Africa, it's in Asia, and so on. And it's real. In the decade of the 90s alone, the earth is scheduled to add 1 billion people. That's twice the number of people being added in a decade that was here at the time of Columbus, period. There is a problem that we might call a resource depletion problem, and when we think of that, we usually think of oil. I think we ought to think of phosphate too, but for a moment, let's think of oil. And the U.S. Geological Survey says that we have 33 years of proven reserves for the world, and perhaps 20 years of unproven reserves. If we were to use only our oil, we would have about a 4-year supply. And that's at the current rate of use. We've had the problem of 2 rather serious nuclear accidents. The one in particular at Chernobyl, where over an area of 1,000 square miles, the Soviets thought at one time they were going to have to burn down the forests, I guess to get in with front-end loaders and dump trucks in order to take it away out of a particular watershed. 27 towns and villages the people will never go home to, at least according to the former Soviet Union. Pripyat had 50,000 people. And the people that drive by there now, I guess it's become something of a tourist place. McDonald's will be sticking something up there, I imagine. But the shutters bang, the asparagus pops through, it doesn't get cut, the trees bloom, set fruit, and nothing happens. It's become a kind of a ghost area. Well, we are now coming to terms with probably the fact that if we are to opt for nuclear power, we're going to have to repeal Murphy's Law. For it seems rather amazing that we've had to wait so long before we decided that Murphy's Law would have to be repealed. And my bet is that neither the Democrats or the Republicans are going to take measures to repeal it. But nevertheless, that is a problem, and we will probably simply let it go and hope that it takes care of itself some way. Well, of course, there's also national debt. I have great authority on this one. I like to get to the very best people when I get information. Lee Iacocca says that if we were to take all of the federal tax money collected from west of the Mississippi River, that's the amount of money that's necessary now to pay the interest on the national debt. That's this year, and next year, and next year. And so, presumably, it's going to work its way meridian by meridian eastward until only Maine is buying anything. But then I have a solution for that problem. We just disband the United States. Why not? Be like, say, you owing me $10,000 and you die. Now, so what's been lost? Well, I realize these are simplistic solutions, but that's what us environmentalists are used to coming up with. At least that's what we're told. Some economists tell me it is something that is real, and that if there is not a paying of that, there is going to be hell to pay. The former president of Costa Rica told a gathering of us a couple of weeks ago that the developed world should forgive the third world debt. Apparently, the interest is now 2 times what the principal was, and that they've already paid back the principal. But if that happens, there will be, according to the Wall Street people, serious dislocations. And I'm still trying to understand what that is a euphemism for. Well, these are all apparent problems. There's the problem of soil erosion, which it worries me, particularly about Iowa. I hate to see Iowa wash away. Texas, that's another matter. But Iowa, to see Iowa wash away will be a very, very sad thing. And yet I understand that in western Iowa we're losing 18 tons of soil per acre per year. And it's happening on some pretty fine corn ground. Well, of course, it isn't just Iowa. The Palouse had something like 200 tons per acre per year a few years ago. I don't know what it's been lately. Matt Liebman at the University of Maine at Orono told me that potato ground is losing 100 tons of soil per acre per year. So the point is that soil erosion seems here to stay. That is, as long as we have any. And then there's the chemical contamination of the countryside. I mentioned this afternoon that this turns out to be one of the great failures of the evolutionary biologist. If there is anything that we should have learned from the Darwinian worldview, it is that you don't introduce chemicals into the environment that our tissues have no evolutionary experience with without first regarding them guilty until proven innocent. And yet we have plunged forward with this. It's very interesting that we have all this hoopla about how to be careful about industrial pollution, and then we promote the chemical contamination of the countryside. Now, there are some rather important reasons that stand behind all of this, of course. I wrote an essay that was published in a magazine for photography, Aperture, I believe it was. The essay was entitled Wilderness is Saint. And what I was trying to point out in that paper was that, you know how you can go into a church and there's a saint and it has special stuff on, that if you pray to that saint, light a candle and so on, you can go in peace and think, well, that's covered. And you can just go on as before. Now, that of course is not what the intent was. In a similar manner, though, we can go into a cathedral, or not a cathedral, but a wilderness cathedral, and we can have a high spiritual uplift, backpack maybe for 2 weeks in the mountains or so, come out all refreshed, send money to the Wilderness Society or the Sierra Club or the Friends of the Earth, and spread atrazine all over Iowa. The wilderness is sacred. Iowa is secular. And either the whole thing is holy or it isn't. But here we have this kind of dichotomy. And this then begins to suggest the problem. It suggests the problem of division, the problem of subject-object, the subject-object dualism, and so on. Well, there may be global warming. I suspect there is such a thing as global warming. The global modelers tell us there's global warming. I tend not to trust anybody that presumes to be able to model the globe. They are what we would call the ultimate lumpers in taxonomy. But there is a place, I guess, for the lumper. It's a way of accommodating know-nothingism. But nevertheless, there is a presumption that there is a global warming, and enough taking it seriously. I guess Shell Oil Company is increasing the height of a platform in the North Sea by 1 meter at a cost of $30 million because this platform that they're building now is expected to have a life of some 70 years. Well, and then, of course, there is the ozone hole. 25 years ago, chlorofluorocarbons would have been on essentially every chemist's short list. Non-toxic, non-corrosive, non-polluting, did a lot of wonderful things, and there they are. John Cobb, the philosopher at Claremont, tells me that children, he visited Australia, some children in Australia are now wearing sunglasses, and there are estimates on what the increase in skin cancer is going to be. And so here we have all of these apparent problems which stand before us, and somehow or another we seem to be unable to come to terms with the philosophical assumptions that stand behind those problems. And I'll suggest, for one, a reality that stands behind it. It has to do with Descartes' statement, which appears in his Discourse on Method. Descartes says that the more he sought to inform himself, the more he realized how ignorant he was. But rather than regard that as an apt description of the human condition, that we're ignorant, and the very proper result of a good education, that we're ignorant, Descartes thought our ignorance was correctable. And so we have a knowledge-based worldview. The belief that our knowledge is adequate to run the world. And so acid rain comes out of a knowledge-based worldview. That is, the commitment to coal-fired plants has to be based on the assumption that we know what we're doing, and if there's a problem, we can patch it up. A global warming comes out of a knowledge-based worldview. A Chernobyl comes out of a knowledge-based worldview. This is the basis of the industrial mind. that our knowledge is adequate to run the world. And yet we know, when we think about it just a little bit, that we're billions of times more ignorant than knowledgeable. So why not an ignorance-based worldview? That is, to start with the assumption, having been raised as a good Methodist, I start with the assumption that we're stupid, we're wicked, and we're sloppy. And that's just ordinary prudence, that you start with that assumption. Now, from there, you work your way up to some kind of modern, some sort of medium level of deliverance. But by and large, the Methodists assume that they're not going to win. Some people live with their sins and some die with them. And the Methodists do both. But to start with the assumption that, that we're billions of times more ignorant than knowledgeable, think of what that does paradoxically. Paradoxically, it forces us to remember things, to hope for second chances, and to keep the scale small so you can back out. It teaches you to study the exits. To study the exits. And if we were to start with that assumption, if we had started with that assumption, it's likely we would not have had the Industrial Revolution as such. But now that the bills for the Industrial Revolution are coming due, we see that, that we've gone too far, too fast, too heedlessly. Well, I want to talk just a little bit about some more of those, what stands behind this Industrial Revolution. And eventually I'll warm to my topic, and along about 10 o'clock I'll get to the upshot of this lecture. But for the moment, for another hour or two, I'd like to carry on with senile rapture. Wendell Berry has written an essay entitled Two Economies. It's in his book, Home Economics. And he says that when the wheels of the Industrial Revolution began to revolve, they turned against nature. In the minds of those early people, the human, everything but the human was nature, and the assumption must have been that nature was passively subject to human purpose. Now, Wendell goes on to say that what we turn against turns against us. Blake foresaw this. William Blake foresaw this. If you take the word control, its root meaning is to roll against. Blake talked about the satanic wheels, the satanic mills. He talked about wheel without wheel, which meant wheel outside of wheel. Kind of like two cog wheels, where you have two cog wheels turning, and for them to turn, they must turn in opposition. Now, this is acceptable enough as a mechanism, but it becomes a ruling metaphor. But as Wendell Berry points out, when it becomes a ruling metaphor and is used to describe and to organize fundamental relationships, then we have a problem. Now, against the satanic wheel without wheel, Blake set the wheels of Eden, which wheel within wheel in freedom revolve. In other words, if you have a wheel inside of a wheel turning, both of them have to be turning in the same direction. And this gets us back, the relation of these wheels is not mechanical. As we know from Ezekiel 1:21, where, quote, and remember Ezekiel's having this vision, the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. In other words, the processes of nature fundamentally involve the wheels within wheels turning in harmony. And when the wheels were set outside, they were forced to turn against. And this characterized the Industrial Revolution. So, Wendell in that essay continues by saying, our economy is a little wheel turning in opposition to what we call nature. We then set up competitiveness as the ruling principle in our explanation of reality and in our understanding of economy. We make of it, he says, willy-nilly a virtue. But competitiveness as a ruling principle and a virtue imposes a logic that is extremely difficult, perhaps impossible to control. That logic, Wendell says, explains why our cars and our clothes are shoddily made, why our wastes are toxic, and why our defensive weapons are suicidal. It explains why it is so difficult for us to draw a line between free enterprise and crime. In our economic ideal, if our economic ideal is maximum profit with minimum responsibility, why should we be surprised to find our corporations so frequently in court and robbery on the increase? Why should we be surprised to find that medicine has become an exploitative industry, profitable in direct proportion to its hurry and its mechanical indifference? And Wendell continues, if on the other hand, we see ourselves as living within the great economy, nature's economy, under the necessity of making our little human economy within it, according to its terms, the smaller wheel turning in sympathy with the greater, the smaller wheel meaning our economy receiving its being and its motion from it, then we see that the traditional virtues are necessary and are practically justifiable. Well, we're now at that point in history where we have coined the term sustainable agriculture. It's a value term like honesty, truth, justice, a term whose definition must be protected. I've had people say to me, now just give me a definition of sustainable agriculture. And I've finally become weary and said, okay, give me a definition of justice. And then tell me to what extent you think we succeed in exercising justice. Somebody with a $300 car runs an intersection and runs into a Mercedes-Benz that costs $20-some thousand, and the person with the little car and small income pays. Is that justice? Well, the point is, though, regardless of how difficult it is for justice to be working out perfectly, we've organized society around that concept. I mean, after all, we're a nation. 5% of the people has 70% of the lawyers of the world. We must be interested in justice. That's just a known truth, I think. I realize there's some other contingencies there that could stimulate some debate. But the point is that here we have this concept of sustainable agriculture that's a value term and a term whose definition must be protected. It should be protected by those that brought it into the cognitive realm. But we should remember that just at the point when we develop language describing virtue, the language describing virtue usually comes at the time the virtue is lost. Lao Tzu talked about appearances of virtue. Lao Tzu said this: when people lost sight of the way to live, came codes of love and honesty. Lose sight of the way to live, then you get a code for love and honesty. When differences weaken family ties, came benevolent fathers and dutiful sons. And when lands were disrupted and misgoverned, then you get ministers commended as loyal. Virtue comes when there's been a loss of it. Cognition of virtue comes with the loss of the virtue. This is probably, I'll stay away from Matthew 6 because, you can quote Lao Tzu in the Greeks and you're all right, but you quote the Bible and you're a religious fundamental, so I'll just stay away from Matthew 6. You look it up. If any of you have checked that lately, it has to do with the appearances, preserving the appearances. Well, what do? We can simply punt and say we're lost, or we could keep hacking away at the problems that we're now confronted with, the problems that involve, that are apparently the result of certain things, or we can turn back and say, now wait a minute, what has been going wrong here? We have been operating under the assumption that human knowledge is adequate to run the world, and we're going to predicate the future exercises in extricating ourselves from this based on human intellect, based on what is piled up in the libraries and so on. Now, please, I'm not for a moment saying we shouldn't pursue knowledge. Rather, I am saying let's acknowledge that knowledge is inadequate, and let's turn to what has been working for hundreds of millions of years, and that is nature, the natural ecosystems that have featured the recycling of all materials and have run on sunlight. In other words, here we are, deeply embedded in the extractive economy. We're fossil fuel dependent. We're dependent upon natural gas. We're dependent upon coal. We are living out of the past. We're living on the failure of breakdown of living organisms in the past, running on the oxygen that accumulated, and we seem to be bent on reversing that process. What can we do to move away from that extractive economy? Is it possible for us to reverse an economic system that came into being with the assumption that resources were infinite, or if not infinite, there was infinite substitutability? That's the definition. Those are the underlying assumptions of modern capitalism. And yet, if we look at the economy of nature, that economy is based on if there was a mindedness to it, the assumption that these materials turn over, and any system in which they didn't turn over became extinct, and it has to run on sunlight. Now, nature then would become our reference point. And we would then repudiate the dominating dogma that has come out of the legacy of Bacon and Descartes. Bacon said explicitly, we must bend nature to our will. And Descartes says yes, and the way you do that is, this is a free translation, the way you do that is place priority on the parts of things over the whole, without acknowledging that there is an interpenetration between part and whole. Whole influences part, part influences whole. Now, the modern Baconian, Cartesian, scientific paradigm is based on it carries with it the assumption that the world is like that method. Well, what we all know is that as we go up that hierarchy of structure, from atoms to molecules to cells to tissues to organ systems to organisms to ecosystems, going up that hierarchy of structure at each one of the levels, there are emergent qualities. That is, qualities that build up that are not predictable based on the properties of the lower units. P.W. Anderson, in a wonderful paper in 1972 entitled More is Different. P.W. Anderson was at the Bell Labs at that time, and he since got a Nobel Prize. He talked about how the ammonia molecule has the ability to turn itself inside out. I guess it's called tunneling. And he challenged any physicist to be able to predict, based on the properties of the atoms going into it, that emergent property, or emergent quality of tunneling would have been predictable. You get to it after the fact. You can work at it backwards. All right, so here we have this worldview of Bacon and Descartes in the placement of priority on part over whole, and the assumption that the world is like the method. And on the other hand, because we know of this interpenetration between part and whole, even though we know about this interpenetration between part and whole, we don't develop the methodology for organizing our science around it. And it seems to me that this has got to be the challenge for the universities, particularly the scientists, but people all through the university, to begin to think about how we come to terms with that reality. Well, now this idea of nature as a standard, or nature as the measure, as Wendell Berry has pointed out, this is in another paper, goes back at least 2,000 years before Jesus of Nazareth. Job said, he cited Job, who said, "Ask now the beasts, and they shall teach thee, and the fowls of the air, and they shall tell thee, or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee, and the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee." Then there is Virgil, who at the beginning of the Georgics, now this is from 36 to 29 BC, Virgil informs us that before we plow an unfamiliar patch, it is well to be informed about the winds. I wish the people that plowed the Great Plains had heard that. We wouldn't have had the Dust Bowl. Before we plow an unfamiliar patch, it is well to be informed about the winds, about the variations in the sky, the native traits and habits of the place, what each locale permits and what denies. Now, Wendell's historical recollection included the writing of Edmund Spenser, who toward the end of the 1500s calls nature the equal mother of all creatures, who knittest each to each as brother unto brother. And we get verification of that in this modern world of molecular biology, when we know we're all made of the same 20 amino acids, whether we're a redwood or a whale or an osprey or a Homo sapien, the same 20 amino acids, the same 4 nucleic acid bases. Spenser says, nature, the equal mother of all creatures, who knittest each to each as brother unto brother. Now, Spenser also saw nature as the instructor of creatures and the ultimate earthly judge of their behavior. Wendell went on to say that in Shakespeare's As You Like It, Shakespeare has the forest in the role of teacher and judge. And Milton in Comus has the lady say, "She," meaning nature, "good cateress, means her provision only to the good that live according to her sober laws, means her provision only to the good that live according to her sober laws and holy dictate of spare temperance. And finally, Alexander Pope, in his epistle to Burlington, counseled gardeners to, quote, let nature never be forgot, and consult the genius of the place in all. Now, I'm not a student of literature, but Wendell Berry says that this theme departs from English poetry, this idea of nature as a measure or a standard. It departs from English poetry after Pope, with the latter poets seeing nature and humans radically divided. The idea of a practical harmony between land and people was just not on their agenda.